April 30th, 1975, with the flag of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. At the Saigon Presidential Palace, slowly rising, the United States, which had fought in Vietnam for decades, and its backed South Vietnamese regime, was completely defeated. On May 1st, all of South Vietnam was liberated. And just hours earlier that day, the last batch of American soldiers had to board helicopters amid the rumbling sound of North Vietnamese artillery, left Saigon in defeat, saying farewell to the Vietnam that cost the United States 58,000 lives. Thus, the 20-year-long Vietnam War finally came to an end. So, this war, an enduring U.S. nightmare. How did it occur? Over a span of 20 years, what were they fighting against the Vietnamese? In this video, we will discuss one of the 20th century's key events, the Vietnam War. Vietnam was originally a French colony. During over 90 years of colonial rule, in order to secure their own interests, the French backed several puppet regimes in Vietnam. They exploited the cheap local labor, forcing countless Vietnamese to build bridges and roads. They were forced to work in mines and harvest herbs. They also plundered countless coal resources and natural resources such as rubber. By the early 1940s, the situation in Europe had worsened. After World War II began, the French quickly surrendered after only a few days. They became a subordinate to Germany. So, the Japanese, who once dreamed of world domination, took the opportunity to invade Southeast Asia. They dispatched troops to take over Vietnam. Afterwards, the Vietnamese had to obey the Japanese armed with bayonets while also enduring French oppression. Under such dual exploitation, therefore, it fostered many Vietnamese with an unwavering spirit of resistance. It also gave rise to a leader as legendary as a man of Puritan simplicity and resolve, Ho Chi Minh. It was precisely by personally witnessing firsthand that he could truly understand the hardships of the struggle and its necessity. In 1911, 20-year-old Ho Chi Minh was targeted for opposing French colonialists. Though he was forced to flee overseas for refuge, he constantly reminded himself to never forget his original aspiration. He never stopped fighting for Vietnam's independence and freedom. In the revolutionary struggle, during his long years in exile, Ho Chi Minh spent most of his time in China. He traveled to China many times to study, and later actively joined China's war of resistance against Japan. In 1941, as France suffered a crushing defeat, its momentum waned. Ho Chi Minh, who had spent decades in exile, seized the opportunity to return home and founded the Viet Minh. He aimed to lead his people in resisting Japan and France. Then, in August 1945, after the end of World War II and Japan's defeat, the Vietnamese believed their hardships were finally ending. Yet, French stubbornly refused to leave. They sought to rekindle their old dreams and continue the toil of colonial rule. Thus, the French dispatched a large army that swiftly occupied the entire southern region of Vietnam. Helpless, the Vietnamese had no choice but to take up arms again. A new colonial war broke out. However, at that time, World War II had just ended. The entire country of Vietnam lay in ruins, facing hundreds of thousands of returning French troops. The Vietnamese National Army had only about 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers. They were simply no match for them. Therefore, in the early stages of the war, the Vietnamese forces suffered a series of defeats. They were forced to retreat to the northern highlands, relying on the assistance of international friends. Using the tactic of enemy advances, we retreat. They held out until after 1953, when conditions improved. During this period, the well-equipped French army also paid a heavy price. They suffered over 100,000 casualties. 6 commanders were dismissed. In 1954, during the Dien Bien Phu campaign in northwestern Vietnam, both sides launched a large-scale decisive battle. At that time, the French planned to use Dien Bien Phu as a base to annihilate the main Vietnamese forces and regain the initiative on the battlefield. When the Vietnamese learned of the plan, under the command of Commander Unyielding, they launched a surprise attack, deploying 50,000 troops to encircle 20,000 French soldiers in a valley. Relying solely on the French's equipment advantage, the Vietnamese adopted a steady, methodical approach, a strategy to defeat the enemy in stages. After being besieged for over a month, with over half the French force lost, they were forced to surrender. The crushing defeat at Dien Bien Phu not only shattered the French colonial dream, but also forced them to sit at the negotiating table. They eventually signed a ceasefire agreement. In July 1954, both sides set the 17th parallel as a military peace agreement in Geneva. Vietnam was temporarily split into two parts. Ho Chi Minh led the North. The French prepared their South withdrawal. However, the signing of the Geneva Agreement greatly displeased the Americans. They feared that if all Vietnam fell to communists, other Southeast Asian nations might soon follow. They feared incalculable consequences for U.S. interests in the region. Thus, as soon as the French left, the Americans quickly arrived. Using the pretext of containing communism, they were determined to act decisively. Thus, in 1955, after the French withdrawal, the Americans rushed into South Vietnam and supported a puppet regime led by Nguyen H. Diem, splitting Vietnam into two hostile states. According to the Geneva Conference, after the French left, no nation was allowed to deploy military forces in Vietnam. Initially, the U.S. just advised and trained South Vietnam. U.S. armed, South fought. The South fought. The Saigon regime was corrupt and greedy, clinging to American support. It also brutally massacred and persecuted its opponents under the pretext of eliminating dissent. So, to fight for democracy and freedom, South Vietnamese people launched a fierce armed struggle and formed the National Liberation Front. A longer and more brutal war for national liberation then began once again. At first, the South Vietnamese puppet army struggled to counter elusive guerrilla hit and run attacks and suffered continuous setbacks. In May 1961, in a bid to salvage its crumbling regime, U.S. President Kennedy sent special forces into South Vietnam and set up a special warfare command. They launched bombers to strike Vietnamese farms while armored units cleared the area in an attempt to cut off the food supply of North Vietnamese forces. But after the French defeat, Ho Chi Minh did not invade the South. He focused on rebuilding the North. This earned him high prestige among the Vietnamese people. In contrast, Diem in the South ruled oppressively and failed to win the people's support. In 1963, a monk protested Diem's Buddhist repression and even self-immolated in public. Note, many in Vietnam's religious populace were affected. Attempt to sever, food supply cut off. After the French were repelled, Ho Chi Minh did not expand southward. Instead, focused on rebuilding North Vietnam, earned high regard among the people. In contrast, Diem used harsh rule and was unpopular. In 1963, a local monk protested Buddhist oppression and self-immolated. Note, in Vietnam, Buddhists make up 80%. Thus, Diem's tyranny quickly sparked nationwide anger. Also on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. His special ops suffered setbacks. Guerrillas weren't wiped out, but grew stronger. Anti-U.S. sentiment soared. Thus, U.S. forces grew disillusioned. Then, some officers staged a coup, killed their stooge Diem, then backed another puppet regime. After Johnson became president, he vowed to preserve South Vietnam. North Vietnamese rallied under Ho Chi Minh, determined to fight fully and overthrow the South government. On August 5, 1964, the U.S. staged the Tonkin Incident, citing attacks on U.S. ships. By the North Vietnamese Navy as excuse, deployed bombers and launched wide strikes on the North, and secured further troops, deployed massive troops. The showdown with the North began. After the U.S. landed, special operations escalated. To hit both sides, they hoped their unmatched force would quickly win, conquer the South, defeat the North. In the South, they fought guerrillas in the highlands. Bombers deployed to target North transport, industrial sites, and bases. South Vietnam soon burned, while North Vietnam filled with smoke. Over the next 9 years, U.S. forces intermittently deployed bomber squadrons. Countless tons of napalm bombs were dropped on North Vietnam. Air bombs, totaling 8 million tons, equivalent to WE's global bomb tonnage multiplied by 4. Yet the Vietnamese did not yield. For survival, they dug 2-meter-deep underground shelters. Armed with semi- and automatic rifles and various machine guns, they engaged in repeated clashes in fierce combat. While U.S. jets ruled the skies, on land, however, U.S. troops knew nothing of Vietnam's terrain, trudging through meter-high grass and dense jungle. They endured great hardships, but nimble locals moved as swiftly as the wind. They lured U.S. troops into well-set ambushes, wiping them out completely. In Sept 1965, they led U.S. forces into the highlands, then ambushed and annihilated them. A complete rout. In Sept 1965, in the Drang Valley, North Vietnam's elite clashed with U.S. forces. In their first major battle, massive combat erupted. To maneuver quickly in the jungle, U.S. helicopters became the backbone for troop and supply transport. In contrast, North Vietnam's equipment was far simpler. They had no armored artillery, nor bombers. Heavy guns came from China or the USSR. Yet each Vietnamese victory largely owed to guerrilla tactics. Partly due to U.S. reliance on the M16, they had only outdated artillery, dependent on support from China or the USSR. Every win was spurred by guerrilla warfare. Vietnam's successes largely stemmed from the decisive impact of its guerrillas, due in large part to U.S. reliance on the M16. Design flaws. Sometimes when facing relentless AK fire from Vietnamese guerrillas, their weapons often jam at crucial moments, resulting in them being completely overrun. To encircle the North Vietnamese army and guerrillas. Meanwhile, the U.S. Air Force was far from idle. A continuous stream of fighter jets and B-52 bombers roared across the skies over North Vietnam. They even dropped shells on tens of thousands of North Vietnamese villages in a carpet bombing campaign. Especially the B-52s. A single bombing run could nearly flatten a village of several hundred residents, reducing it to rubble. From a military standpoint, this might have seemed a success for the U.S. forces. But in doing so, destroying one village also sparked even fiercer resistance. The harsher the raids, the more they awakened Vietnamese defiance. By 1968, after more than 3,000 aircraft were shot down and over 30,000 soldiers lost, the U.S. failed to achieve its expected results. Its forces were then increased to over 500,000 troops. That year marked a turning point, just after the Lunar New Year. Over 80,000 North Vietnamese soldiers and guerrillas launched a joint offensive after booming gunfire echoed across regions. U.S. generals in Saigon mistook it for New Year's fireworks. But by the next day, North Vietnamese combat had spread to dozens of South Vietnamese cities. Guerrillas had even infiltrated Saigon, attacking the U.S. embassy. It turned out that many North Vietnamese soldiers disguised as civilians, in cooperation with guerrillas, used the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They infiltrated deep into Saigon. It turned out that many North Vietnamese soldiers disguised as South Vietnamese civilians coordinated with local guerrillas. Using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they had already infiltrated major cities in South Vietnam and were fully prepared for combat. After the joint offensive began, one of the fiercest battles took place in the Hue area of South Vietnam. Over 20,000 North Vietnamese soldiers launched a fierce assault, laying a tight siege around the U.S. stronghold in Hue. To defend Hue, the U.S. Air Force at the time deployed an average of 300 fighter jets daily to support the defense. The ancient capital of Hue was reduced to ruins. Over 2 months of fighting. Although the U.S. eventually gained the upper hand, what it brought to the American people across the ocean was not joy, but shock. During the conflict, one U.S. infantry squad failed to pursue the retreating North Vietnamese troops. Out of frustration, They took out their anger on unarmed civilians instead. They opened fire on more than 500 elderly and children in a central Vietnamese village called My Lai. This became the world-shocking My Lai massacre. When the footage was broadcast back in the US, the American public began to see clearly the ugly face of their government. They were told they were helping liberate the Vietnamese from tyranny, but what they saw was US troops burning villages, slaughtering innocents. Many Americans began to rethink this jungle war. When would it end? Their long-suppressed anger finally erupted. An anti-war sentiment surged rapidly. In New York, large numbers of citizens took to the streets with marches and strikes to express their outrage. As many as 300,000 people participated. In the following years, protests across the U.S. grew louder and more frequent. In many states, mass demonstrations of over 1 million people broke out. The anti-war movement reached unprecedented intensity. Heavy casualties on the front, unrest erupting at home. A desperate President Johnson was eventually forced to withdraw from the next election. This was never a just war to begin with. Its downfall was inevitable. In 1969, aside from weekly averages of over 100 planes being shot down every week, the U.S. military also suffered over 200 casualties weekly. That same year, Nixon, the new U.S. president, made a bold move. He ordered the bombing of Cambodia. This was a sovereign and neutral country, but Nixon believed North Vietnamese troops were hiding in Cambodian jungles. So he launched an unannounced airstrike. In a single year, U.S. forces dropped over 100,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia. As a result, tens of thousands of civilians were killed, but the North Vietnamese army remained untouched. This reckless move completely backfired, fueling an even stronger anti-war movement back home. In 1970, across the U.S., more than 2 million people took to the streets, and during one protest at Kent State, National Guardsmen opened fire on students, killing 4 and injuring 9. This tragic event shocked the entire nation. It made people question the moral compass of their own country. By this point, Nixon realized this war was a quagmire, so he began a strategy called Vietnamization, training and arming South Vietnamese troops to take over the fighting themselves. At the same time, U.S. troops started a gradual withdrawal. From 1970 to 1972, American troop presence dropped from over 500,000 to just around 100,000. By this time, North Vietnam was already gaining the upper hand. South Vietnam, losing its main supporter, began to struggle on the battlefield. Despite this, the U.S. still tried to force a peace with honor through negotiations. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, and U.S. troops officially withdrew. But the war hadn't ended. South Vietnam was left to face the North alone. With American aid cut off in 1974, the South collapsed rapidly. By April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The Vietnam War finally came to an end, but the scars it left behind would last forever. In fact, the Americans had long anticipated it at the time. But what they hadn't expected was to lose so quickly, so fast, in fact, that they didn't even have time to implement their already prepared evacuation plan. As a result, the chaotic evacuation scene unfolded in Saigon. American troops fled in disarray. Pilots even leapt into the sea. Masses of South Vietnamese swarmed the Saigon airport, flooded the U.S. embassy, trying to squeeze onto the American evacuation planes to escape Vietnam. On April 30th, 1975, the final batch of U.S. helicopters landed in Saigon. And by that evening, from the rooftop and surrounding areas of the U.S. Embassy, they hurriedly evacuated over 1,000 remaining U.S. soldiers and diplomats. This scene is now considered one of the most symbolic and humiliating moments in U.S. history. Right after the final American forces left South Vietnam, North Vietnamese troops captured the capital that same day. When they stormed the South Vietnamese government building, the former presidential palace was already left undefended. In this war, even though the United States deployed every advanced weapon except nuclear arms, it still ended in total failure. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. spent over $200 billion. More than 58,000 American soldiers lost their lives in a foreign land. Of course, as the main battlefield, Vietnam paid an even heavier price. Although they achieved national unification, over 2 million Vietnamese were killed or wounded. The land was left scarred, and devastation was everywhere. By 1986, after years of rest, recovery, and rebuilding, Vietnam's economy finally began to recover after reforms. Looking back on the fleeting century of history, history often has a strange way of repeating itself. Different choices may lead to different scripts, but in the end, they all reach the same destination. Perhaps only those who have never been to war are the ones obsessed with who won and who lost. But true war, in war, are there really any winners or losers? All that remains is destruction and devastation.